In the spring of 1452, in a house on a hillside above the town of Vinci, a child was born who would spend his life trying to see what held the world together. He was illegitimate, which meant he could not inherit his father's profession, could not join the guild his grandfather belonged to, could not follow the established routes that opened for legitimate sons in Tuscany. His father was Ser Piero da Vinci, a notary, a man who made his living writing contracts and witnessing signatures in Florence. His mother was Caterina, a young woman from a nearby village, perhaps a servant, perhaps the daughter of farmers. The records do not say much about her, and what they do say is sparse and cool. The child was named Leonardo, and he was raised for his first years in his mother's house, then taken into his father's household in Vinci, where his grandfather Antonio also lived. The boy grew up between two worlds, neither of which would fully claim him, and this may have been the first gift the world gave him, the ability to stand outside the structures that told other people what to think and what to see. Vinci was not a city. It was a small town in the hills northwest of Florence, a place of olive groves and vineyards, stone farmhouses and narrow roads. The countryside around it was the kind of landscape that holds its beauty quietly, without drama. There were cypresses on the ridges, streams cutting through the valleys, the distant silhouette of Florence visible on clear days. Leonardo grew up walking those hills, watching the way water moved over rock, the way light pooled in the folds of the land at dusk, the way birds rode the air without seeming to work for it. He drew things. He was left-handed, and he wrote from right to left in a mirror script that would remain his habit for the rest of his life. He had no formal schooling in Latin or Greek, the languages of educated men, because illegitimate children were not given that kind of education. What he had instead was his eyes, his hands, and a world that did not yet know it was about to be examined with the precision it had never experienced before. When he was 14, his father took him to Florence and apprenticed him to Andrea del Verrocchio, a painter and sculptor whose workshop was one of the most technically sophisticated in the city. This was in 1466. Florence was not yet the Florence of the High Renaissance, but it was already a place where the past was being taken apart and reassembled, where the study of ancient sculpture and the application of mathematical perspective to painting were turning art into a form of knowledge as much as craft. Verrocchio's workshop was on the Via dell'Agnolo, and it was not a quiet place. It was full of noise and purpose, apprentices grinding pigments, mixing plaster, preparing panels, learning to cast bronze and carve marble. Verrocchio himself was a master of multiple disciplines. He made paintings, but he also made sculptures, designed tombs, worked in silver and gold, and took commissions for anything from a banner for a joust to a bronze ball for the dome of Florence Cathedral. Leonardo entered this world at the age when a boy's hand is still learning what it can do, and he learned everything at once. If you found your way here and you'd like to stay, there's a subscribe button just below and a like if this is already the kind of night you were hoping for. Now, back to the story. Apprenticeship in a Florentine workshop meant years of preparation before you were allowed to contribute to a finished work. You learned to prepare a panel, to grind minerals into pigment, to mix egg tempera so that it held its color and didn't crack as it dried. You learned to draw from plaster casts of ancient sculpture, to understand how a body moved in space, how drapery fell over a knee or a shoulder, how light created the illusion of volume. Verrocchio's workshop was especially known for its technical rigor. He insisted that his apprentices understand not just how to paint a thing, but how the thing itself was constructed. The mechanics of a human arm, the engineering of a bridge, the anatomy of a horse. This approach shaped Leonardo in ways that would mark everything he did. He did not learn to paint as a separate skill from understanding the world. He learned that to paint a thing well, you had to know how it worked. There is a painting from this period called The Baptism of Christ, made by Verrocchio and his workshop around 1475. It shows Christ standing in the river Jordan while John the Baptist pours water over his head. Two angels kneel in the foreground, holding Christ's garments. The painting is in tempera on wood, and most of it is workmanlike, competent, the kind of devotional image that workshops produced by the dozen. But one of the angels is different, the one on the left turning slightly toward the viewer, his face soft and ambiguous, his curls rendered with a delicacy that makes the other figures look stiff. That angel was painted by Leonardo. The story, passed down through Vasari and others, is that when Verrocchio saw what his apprentice had done, he put down his brushio saw what his apprentice had done, he put down his brushes and never painted again. The story is almost certainly not true, but it tells you what people wanted to believe about Leonardo even then, that he had arrived in the world already knowing things that other people had to be taught. What Leonardo was learning in those years was not just technique, he was learning to see the world as a set of problems that could be solved through observation and experiment. Verrocchio's workshop took commissions that required engineering as much as artistry. When the workshop was tasked with creating a large bronze sculpture, Leonardo would have been part of the process of figuring out how to cast it, how to build the mold, how to calculate the amount of metal needed, how to keep the bronze from cooling unevenly and cracking. These were not separate from painting. They were all part of the same inquiry. How does the world work? How do materials behave? How do you turn an idea in your mind into a thing that exists in space? Florence in the 1470s was a city where this kind of inquiry was valued, at least in certain circles. The Medici family, and especially Lorenzo de' Medici, who became the de facto ruler of the city in 1469, cultivated artists and thinkers, supported workshops, collected manuscripts, and created an atmosphere in which painting, sculpture, poetry, and philosophy were all seen as part of a shared project of understanding and beautifying the world. Leonardo moved in this world, but never quite belonged to it. He was not a humanist in the formal sense. He could not read Latin fluently, could not quote Plato or Cicero, the way the poets and scholars around Lorenzo could. But he had something else. He had an eye for the way things moved, the way they balanced, the way they failed. He could look at a bird in flight and understand that its wings were not just flapping but shaping the air, creating currents that could be mapped and maybe imitated. By his early 20s, Leonardo was no longer just an apprentice. He was taking commissions of his own, though many of them would remain unfinished. There is a painting called The Annunciation, probably begun around 1472, which shows the angel Gabriel arriving to tell Mary that she will bear a son. The painting is full of ambition and also full of the awkwardness of a young artist still learning to control his materials. The perspective is not quite right. The angel seems too large for the space. The marble table in front of Mary recedes at an angle that does not match the pavement beneath it. But the angel's wings are extraordinary. They are not the stylized, decorative wings that appear in most Florentine paintings of the period. They are the wings of a real bird, studied from life, each feather articulated, the structure of the wing understood as a mechanical thing. Even then, Leonardo could not paint something without trying to understand how it worked. He was also drawing constantly. The drawings that survive from this period show a mind that could not stay still. There are studies of drapery, folds of cloth arranged over a mannequin and rendered in such detail that you can see the weight of the fabric, the way it catches the light. There are sketches of machines, pulleys, gears, cranks, copied from Verrocchio's workshop or imagined on his own. There are studies of hands, of faces, of horses. There are also drawings of things that had nothing to do with any commission he was working on. A cat in different poses, twisting and stretching. A lily, drawn as if you were trying to count its parts. A grotesque old man with a jutting chin and a hooked nose, the kind of face Leonardo would draw over and over for the rest of his life, as if he found something endlessly fascinating in the extremes of human appearance. In 1476, Leonardo's name appears in a legal document. He and 3 other young men were anonymously accused of sodomy, a crime that could carry the death penalty in Florence. The charge was investigated twice and dismissed both times for lack of evidence. The records do not tell us what happened, or whether anything happened at all. What they tell us is that Leonardo was living in a world that policed the boundaries of acceptable behavior, and that his life, like the lives of many young men in Florence, was subject to scrutiny and suspicion. He never married. He lived for most of his life in households of male apprentices and assistants. The nature of his intimate life is something the historical record does not give us access to, and speculation is cheap. What matters is that he was someone who did not fit neatly into the social categories available to him, and that this must have been both a freedom and a loneliness. By 1481, Leonardo was in his late 20s and restless. He had commissions in Florence, but they were not going well. He had been asked to paint an altarpiece for the monks of San Donato, a sculptor, a large panel showing the adoration of the Magi. He began the work with his usual intensity, drawing dozens of preparatory sketches, working out the composition in exhaustive detail. The underdrawing that survives shows a scene of astonishing complexity. Dozens of figures crowded around the Virgin and Child, horses rearing in the background, architectural ruins framing the scene, every figure caught in a different moment of recognition or wonder. But he did not finish it. He worked on the painting for months, maybe a year, and then he left Florence without completing it. The panel was left behind, unfinished, a ghost of what it might have been. But, in 1482, Leonardo moved to Milan. He went seeking the patronage of Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, who was not yet officially the Duke, but was ruling the city in fact if not in name. Leonardo wrote him a letter, a strange and ambitious document in which he presented himself not primarily as a painter, but as a military engineer. He described all the things he could do: design portable bridges for armies on the march, create siege engines, build cannons, divert rivers, construct armored vehicles. Almost as an afterthought, at the end of the letter he mentioned that he could also paint and sculpt. The letter was a sales pitch, and it worked. Ludovico brought him to Milan, though not for the reasons Leonardo might have hoped. What Ludovico wanted, at least at first, was not a military engineer, but a court artist, someone who could design pageants and theatrical productions, paint portraits, and work on a massive bronze equestrian statue of Ludovico's father, Francesco Sforza. Milan was different from Florence. It was larger, wealthier, more tied to the courts and politics of northern Italy. It was a city of canals and fortifications, of processions and ceremonies, of ducal power expressed through spectacle. Leonardo spent nearly 17 years there, and they were among the most productive years of his life, though productivity for Leonardo was always a complicated term. He took on commissions, but he also pursued projects that had no patron and no obvious purpose. He studied anatomy, dissecting corpses in the hospital of Santa Maria Nuova, and making drawings of muscles, tendons, organs, the structures of the eye and the heart. He filled notebooks with observations about the movement of water, the flight of birds, the mechanics of human vision. He designed machines that no one had asked him to design: a tank, a helicopter, a parachute, a diving suit. Some of these designs were fanciful, unworkable with the materials and technology of the time. Others were startlingly practical, anticipating inventions that would not be realized for centuries. The bronze horse was supposed to be his great public achievement in Milan. It was to be a monument to Francesco Sforza, a statue so large that it would dwarf anything that had been made since antiquity. Leonardo spent years on it, studying horses, drawing them from every angle, reading treatises on proportion and movement, making models in clay and wax. He designed a complex system of molds and supports for casting the bronze, a process that would require more metal than had ever been used for a single sculpture. But the statue was never cast. The bronze that had been set aside for it was requisitioned by Ludovico to make cannons, because Milan was at war, and cannons were more immediately useful than monuments. A full-scale clay model of the horse was displayed in Milan for a time, and people came to see it and marveled at its size and dynamism. But when the French invaded Milan in 1499, French soldiers used the model for target practice, and it was destroyed. Leonardo's great statue became another thing he did not finish, another vision that existed fully only in his notebooks. But while the horse consumed his public ambition, he was also working on something quieter, smaller, and more enduring. In 1495, Ludovico Sforza commissioned him to paint a mural in the refectory of the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. The subject was the Last Supper, a scene that had been painted countless times. Christ and his 12 apostles gathered for the Passover meal, the moment when Christ announces that one of them will betray him. It was a standard subject for a refectory, a room where monks ate their own communal meals. The tradition was to paint it on the end wall so that the monks dining below would see Christ and the apostles dining above them, a layering of earthly and sacred meals. Leonardo approached the commission as he approached everything, by asking questions that no one had asked before. How would each apostle react to the news of betrayal? What would the geometry of the room look like if it were a real room, an extension of the refectory itself? How could the moment be captured not as a static arrangement of figures, but as a narrative unfolding in time, each figure caught in a different instant of shock, grief, anger, or confusion? He spent months, maybe years, just thinking about it, walking through the refectory, staring at the wall, making drawings. The prior of the convent complained that Leonardo would sometimes stand in front of the wall for hours without touching a brush and then leave. Ludovico grew impatient, wanted to know why the work was taking so long. Leonardo reportedly told him that he was still looking for the right face for Judas, and that if he could not find one, he would use the face of the prior face for Judas, and that if he could not find one, he would use the face. The painting he made is not technically a fresco. A true fresco is painted into wet plaster so that the pigment bonds with the wall as the plaster dries. It is a fast process, and it does not allow for the kind of careful blending and revision that Leonardo wanted. So he invented his own technique, a mixture of tempera and oil applied to a dry wall that had been prepared with a layer of gesso and mastic. It allowed him to work slowly, to build up layers of glaze and shadow. It also meant that the painting began to deteriorate almost immediately. The damp from the wall seeped through, the pigments flaked, the surface cracked. Within a few decades, people were already noting that the painting was in poor condition. Within a century, it was badly damaged. Over the centuries, it has been retouched, repainted, partially destroyed by a doorway cut through the bottom center of the composition. Bombed during the Second World War, the refectory was hit, and the wall with the Last Supper survived mostly by chance. It has been restored multiple times, most recently in a controversial 20-year project that ended in 1999, and even now it is fragile. Kept in a climate-controlled environment, visible only to small groups of visitors at a time. It is the most deteriorated of Leonardo's major works and also the most studied, the most copied, the most embedded in the visual memory of Western culture. What survives, even in its damaged state, is a painting of astonishing psychological clarity. Leonardo arranged the 12 apostles in 4 groups of 3, their bodies turning toward or away from Christ, their hands gesturing, reaching, recoiling. Christ himself sits at the center, isolated despite the crowd around him, his face calm, his hands open on the table. The perspective of the room is constructed so that all the orthogonal lines converge on his head, making him the still point around which everything else moves. Each apostle is distinct, not just in appearance, but in the way they inhabit the moment. Peter leans forward, gripping a knife, his face fierce. John slumps to the side, his eyes closed, as if the news has drained him. Judas, instead of being placed on the opposite side of the table as in most earlier depictions, sits among the other apostles, but he is turned slightly away, his face in shadow, his hand reaching toward the bread. The whole composition is a study in gesture and expression, in the way bodies reveal what words have not yet said. Leonardo spent 3 years on the Last Supper, from 1495 to 1498. It was the longest he spent on any single painting, and it was also the closest he came to realizing the vision he carried in his notebooks. the idea that painting was not just a craft but a science, a way of making visible the movement of human emotion and the structure of the visible world. The Last Supper is not a decorative image. It is a narrative engine, a painting that asks you to read it, to follow the gazes and gestures, to reconstruct the moment it depicts. It is also a painting that Leonardo knew, even as he made it, was already failing. The experimental technique he used was not holding. The surface was cracking. But he made it anyway, because the idea demanded to exist, even if its existence would be brief. This is the kind of moment we made this channel for. If you're still with us, and we hope you are, a like or a subscribe goes a long way. Now let's keep going. While Leonardo was working on the Last Supper, he was also filling notebooks. Not just one or two, but dozens, hundreds of pages covered in his mirror script, his mind moving from one subject to another without transition, as if every question were part of the same infinite investigation. On one page, a drawing of a fetus in the womb, the anatomy rendered with a precision that would not be matched until the invention of photography. On the next page, a study of water flowing around an obstacle, the vortices mapped in spirals and curves. On another page, a design for a flying machine, the wings modeled on the structure of a bat. He was studying everything at once, and he was doing it with a rigor that had no precedent. He was not just observing, he was testing, measuring, comparing. He dissected human bodies and made drawings of the heart, the lungs, the network of blood vessels. He filled pages with studies of the muscles of the face, trying to understand how a smile is made, which muscles contract, which relax, how the movement of the mouth changes the shape of the eye. He was not doing this to make better paintings, or not only for that reason. He was doing it because he wanted to know. His obsession with water was especially intense. He studied the way rivers moved, the way water fell from a height and created turbulence, the way it carved through stone over centuries. He made drawings of floods, imagining the end of the world as a deluge, water destroying everything, washing away cities and mountains. He designed canals and locks, systems for irrigation and drainage. He proposed diverting the Arno River to cut off Pisa's access to the sea, a military strategy that was attempted and failed. He filled pages with drawings of vortices, water spiraling in on itself, and he saw the same spiral patterns in hair, in smoke, in the way air moved around a bird's wing. For Leonardo, water was not just a substance, it was a key to understanding motion itself, the way forces moved through the world and shaped it. He also studied human faces with a kind of relentless attention that bordered on the uncanny. He would follow people through the streets of Milan if their faces interested him, watching the way they moved, the way their features shifted with emotion. He drew hundreds of heads, beautiful young men, grotesque old women, profiles of warriors and philosophers, imaginary portraits of people who may never have existed. He was especially drawn to extremes, to faces that were either classically beautiful or strikingly ugly, as if he were trying to map the full range of human appearance. There are drawings of old men with no teeth, their chins jutting out, their noses hooked, their faces collapsing into lines and folds. There are drawings of young men with soft features and ambiguous expressions, their eyes half closed, their mouths hinting at a smile. He drew the same face over and over, a particular kind of androgynous beauty that appears in his paintings and his drawings, the face of Salome, of John the Baptist, of the angel in the Virgin of the Rocks, a face that is neither quite male nor quite female, a face that seems to know something it will not say. In 1499, the French invaded Milan. King Louis XII of France claimed the duchy as his own, and Ludovico Sforza fled the city. Leonardo, who had been in Ludovico's service for 17 years, suddenly had no patron and no clear reason to stay. He left Milan with his household, a group of assistants and apprentices who traveled with him, lived with him, worked with him. Among them was a young man named Giangocco Caprotti, known as Salai, who had entered Leonardo's household as a boy of 10 in 1490 and never left. Vasari describes Salai as a thief and a liar, beautiful and utterly untrustworthy. And Leonardo's notes confirm this. There are records of Salai stealing money, ruining clothes, breaking tools. But Leonardo kept him anyway for 25 years until Leonardo's death. Salai appears in Leonardo's death. Salai appears in Leonardo's drawings, his face rendered with a tenderness that suggests something more than exasperation. Leonardo spent the next few years moving between cities, Venice, Mantua, Florence, Agand. In Venice, he worked briefly as a military engineer, advising the city on how to defend itself against a possible Turkish invasion. He proposed flooding the region, designing a system of locks and dams that could turn the surrounding countryside into an impassable marsh. The plan was not implemented. In Mantua, he drew a portrait of Isabella d'Este, the Marchioness, a woman known for her intelligence and her patronage of the arts. She wanted a painted portrait, but Leonardo delivered it. What survives is a drawing, a cartoon in black chalk and charcoal, Isabella's face in profile, calm and regal, her hands barely sketched in. She wrote to him repeatedly, asking for the painting, and he never answered. By 1500, Leonardo was back in Florence, a city he had left 18 years earlier. Florence had changed. Savonarola's brief theocratic rule had ended with his execution in 1498, and the city was trying to rebuild itself as a republic. The atmosphere was different from the Florence Leonardo had known in his youth, less certain of itself, more anxious. But there was work. The city commissioned him to paint a large fresco in the council hall of the Palazzo Vecchio, a battle scene showing the Florentine victory over Milan at the Battle of Anghiari. It was to be a public monument, a celebration of republican virtue and military prowess, and it was to be painted on a wall opposite a fresco by Michelangelo, who was 23 years younger than Leonardo and already famous for his statue of David. Leonardo began the project with the same mixture of ambition and experimental recklessness that had marked the Last Supper. He made detailed drawings of the battle, horses rearing and colliding, soldiers fighting for a standard, faces twisted with rage and effort. The composition was chaotic and dynamic, a whirlwind of bodies and movement. But when it came time to paint the fresco, he once again refused to use the traditional technique. He tried to use a method he had read about in Pliny, an ancient technique involving heat and oil-based pigments. It did not work. The paint ran, the colors muddied, the surface refused to hold. He abandoned the project. What was left on the wall was eventually covered over by other artists, and the fresco was lost. All that survives are copies and preparatory drawings, including one by Peter Paul Rubens, made a century later, showing the central section of the composition, a tangle of men and horses, violent and alive. While he was in Florence, he also painted, or began to paint, a portrait of a woman named Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a Florentine merchant named Francesco del Giocondo. The painting became known as La Gioconda in Italian, or the Mona Lisa in English, Mona being a contraction of Madonna, a polite form of address. It is a small painting, oil on poplar panel, 77 centimeters by 53 centimeters. It shows a woman seated in front of a landscape, her body turned slightly to the left, her face turned toward the viewer, her hands folded in her lap, her mouth suggesting the beginning of a smile. It is the most famous painting in the world, and it is also one of the strangest, because there is almost nothing about it that explains why it became what it became. Leonardo worked on the painting for years. He may have started it as early as 1503. He may have continued working on it for the rest of his life. He never delivered it to the man who commissioned it. He carried it with him when he left Florence, took it to Milan, to Rome, to France. It was found among his possessions when he died. There are letters from people who saw it in his studio, describing it with admiration, but without any sense that they were looking at something unprecedented. It was, for most of Leonardo's life, just another unfinished portrait. one of dozens of projects he had begun and not completed. What makes the painting strange is not what is in it, but what is not. There is no context, no narrative. The woman is not identified by any symbol or attribute. The landscape behind her is not a real place. It is a composite, a dream of mountains and rivers and winding roads that lead nowhere. The light is even and diffused, coming from no particular sort. The woman's expression is famously ambiguous, described as a smile but also as something more elusive, a look that seems to shift depending on where you stand, how the light falls, what mood you bring to it. Leonardo achieved this effect through a technique called sfumato, a gradual blending of tones so that there are no hard edges, no clear boundaries between light and shadow. The corners of the mouth, the edges of the eyes, these are not drawn. They are suggested, softened, left deliberately unclear. The face emerges from the background not as a fixed thing, but as something that seems to breathe, to change, to withhold itself even as it offers itself to view. Leonardo was obsessed with the mechanics of vision, with how the eye perceives depth and distance, how light and shadow create the illusion of volume. He understood that the eye does not see everything with equal clarity, that peripheral vision is softer, less defined than the center of focus. He applied this understanding to painting, using sfumato to mimic the way the eye actually sees, blurring the edges, leaving certain areas indistinct. The Mona Lisa is a painting made by someone who understood not just how to paint a face, but how a face is seen, how the mind constructs an image from incomplete information. He also understood that a painting could contain time. The Mona Lisa is not a snapshot, it is a duration. The woman is not frozen in a single expression, she is caught between expressions. In the moment before a smile fully forms or just after it begins to fade, the landscape behind her is also in motion, rivers winding, roads curving, mountains receding into atmospheric perspective. It is a painting of a moment, but the moment is not fixed. It is alive, unstable, open. Leonardo did not finish the Mona Lisa, if finishing means completing it, to a point where no further work is needed. He kept working on it, adjusting, refining, adding layers of glaze so thin that they are almost invisible. The painting as it exists now is the result of years of revision, and it is also the result of centuries of aging, the varnish darkening, the colors shifting, the wood panel warping slightly. It is not what it looked like when Leonardo painted it, and we cannot know for certain what it looked like then. What we have is a palimpsest, layers of intention and accident, time and damage, the artist's hand and the world's slow alteration of what he made. In 1513, Leonardo left Florence again, this time for Rome. He was 61 years old. He had been invited by Giuliano de' Medici, the younger brother of Pope Leo X, to join his household. Rome was the center of the art world at that moment. Michelangelo was painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Raphael was decorating the papal apartments. But Leonardo did not thrive there. He was given rooms in the Belvedere, a villa in the Vatican complex, and he set up a workshop, brought his assistants, started projects. But he was not given major commissions. The Pope purportedly said of him, "This man will never accomplish anything, for he begins by thinking about the end before the beginning of the work." It was a harsh judgment, and it was not entirely wrong. Leonardo had always been more interested in the process of investigation than in the finished product. He wanted to understand how things worked, not just make things that pleased patrons. In Rome, he continued his anatomical studies, dissecting corpses in the hospital of Santo Spirito. But someone accused him of sacrilege, of performing black magic, and the Pope forbade him from continuing. He worked on designs for draining the Pontine marshes, a project that was never realized. He studied optics, geometry, the nature of mirrors and reflections. He drew more faces, more machines, more vortices. He was an old man now, his hair long and white, his body slowing down, but his mind was still restless, still moving from one question to another. In 1516, Giuliano de' Medici died, and Leonardo lost his patron in Rome, but he gained another. Francis I, the young king of France, invited him to come to France, offered him a pension and a house near the royal chateau at Amboise. Leonardo accepted. He packed up his belongings, his notebooks, his paintings, including the Mona Lisa, which he still had not delivered to anyone. He traveled across the Alps with his household, Salai, and another assistant named Francesco Melzi, and arrived in France in the winter of 1516. The king gave him the Château du Clos-Lucé, a small manor house near Amboise, connected to the royal chateau by an underground passage. Francis visited him often, sat with him, listened to him talk. Vasari writes that the king called Leonardo "my father," and said that he had never met anyone who knew so much about sculpture, painting, and architecture. Leonardo spent the last 3 years of his life in France. He did not paint much, if at all. His right hand was partially paralyzed, possibly from a stroke, though he could still draw with his left hand. He organized his notebooks, made plans for treatises on water, on anatomy, on painting, none of which were completed. He designed a palace for the king, a vast complex with canals and gardens, a building that was never built. He planned festivals and pageants, designed costumes and mechanical lions that could walk and open their chests to reveal lilies. He was still trying to make things, still imagining projects that were larger than any one lifetime could contain. On the 2nd of May, 1519, Leonardo died at Clos-Lucé. He was 67. Vasari writes that he died in the arms of King Francis, but this is almost certainly a romantic invention. The king was elsewhere that day. What is more likely is that he died attended by Melzi and the household that had traveled with him for so long. He left his notebooks and drawings to Melzi, who tried to organize them but did not succeed. The notebooks were eventually scattered, sold, broken up, and dispersed across Europe. Many were lost. What survives is only a fraction of what Leonardo wrote and drew, but it is still thousands of pages, a vast and fragmented record of a mind that could not stop asking questions. He left his paintings to Salai, though Salai had died a few years earlier, and the bequest went to Salai's sisters. The Mona Lisa was not among them. It had already been sold or given to King Francis, and it entered the French royal collection, where it remained. Over the centuries, it passed from the royal collection to the Louvre, where it has been since the French Revolution, except for a brief period in 1811 when Napoleon hung it in his bedroom, and another in 1911 when it was stolen by an Italian handyman named Vincenzo Perugia, who believed it should be returned to Italy. It was recovered 2 years later and returned to the Louvre, and the publicity from the theft helped turn it into the icon it is today. The Last Supper remained on the wall in Milan, slowly deteriorating. By the 17th century, it was already in poor condition. By the 18th, large sections had flaked away. Restorers repainted it, sometimes badly, adding details that Leonardo never painted, obscuring what was left of the original. During the Second World War, the refectory was bombed, the roof collapsed, and the painting survived under sandbags and scaffolding. After the war, it was restored again and again, each restoration revealing a little more of what was left and also removing a little more of what had been added. The most recent restoration, completed in 1999, stripped away centuries of overpainting and revealed something closer to what Leonardo made, though the surface is still fragile, the colors muted, the faces worn. You cannot see it without booking weeks in advance, and when you do see it, you are allowed only 15 minutes in the room. It is still there, still holding the wall, still unfinished in the sense that Leonardo never stopped thinking about it. The notebooks were scattered across Europe and were not widely published until the 19th century. When they were finally studied, they revealed a mind that was centuries ahead of its time. His drawings of the heart showed valves and chambers that would not be understood until the development of modern cardiology. His studies of fossils led him to conclude that the earth was far older than the biblical account suggested, that mountains had once been under the sea, that the world was shaped by forces that operated over vast stretches of time. His designs for flying machines were based on principles of aerodynamics that would not be formalized until the 20th century. He understood that air was a fluid, that flight required not just flapping wings, but an understanding of lift and drag, that a machine heavier than air could fly if it were designed correctly. He could not build such a machine with the materials available to him, but he understood the principle, and that was enough. He was not a scientist in the modern sense. He did not publish his findings, did not work within a community of researchers, did not build on the work of others in a systematic way. But he was something else, an empiricist, an observer, someone who believed that knowledge came from looking at the world and testing what you saw. He wrote, "All our knowledge has its origins in our perceptions." He wrote, "Study without desire spoils the memory, and it retains nothing that it takes in." He wrote, "The noblest pleasure is the joy of understanding." These were not just aphorisms. They were the principles he lived by, the convictions that shaped every page of his notebooks, every unfinished painting, every half-realized project. Leonardo's central tension was the gap between vision and completion. He saw more than he could make, imagined more than he could finish, asked questions that could not be answered in a single lifetime. He left behind fewer than 30 paintings, and several of those are fragmentary or disputed. He left behind thousands of pages of notes and drawings, but he never published a treatise, never completed the book on anatomy or the book on water or the book on painting that he planned. He started projects and abandoned them, not because he lost interest, but because the investigation itself became more compelling than the finished work. He was someone for whom the process of understanding was more urgent than the product of that understanding. This made him difficult to work with, frustrating to his patrons, impossible to categorize. He was not a reliable court artist. He was not a dependable engineer. He was not a systematic thinker in the way that later scientists would be. But he was something unprecedented, a person who insisted that painting, sculpture, engineering, anatomy, optics, and geology were all part of the same inquiry, all ways of asking the same question: how does the world work, and how can we see it clearly? The myth of Leonardo is the myth of the Renaissance man, the person who could do everything, who embodied the full potential of human capability. It is a myth that Leonardo himself helped create, not through boasting, but through the sheer range of his interests and the depth of his investigations. But the myth is also misleading, because it suggests a kind of effortless mastery, a genius who did everything well without struggle. The truth is more complicated. Leonardo was brilliant, but he was also obsessive, restless, often unable to finish what he started. He was capable of extraordinary precision and also of wild speculation. He could spend years on a single painting and then leave it behind without delivering it. He could design a machine that would not be built for 500 years, and also design a machine that would not be built for 500 years, and also design a machine that could never work at all. He was not a complete human being in the sense of someone bowed and howled. He was someone who pushed himself and his materials to their limits, and who often found that the limits were closer than he wanted them to be. What he left behind is not a coherent body of work, but a series of fragments, paintings so carefully made that they seem to breathe, drawings so precise that they reveal structures invisible to the naked eye, notebooks full of ideas that could not be realized in his lifetime. And yet those fragments are enough. They are enough to show what he saw, what he wanted, what he spent his life reaching toward. The Last Supper, even in ruins, still stops people in their tracks, still asks them to look at 12 men reacting to a piece of news and to see in those reactions something about what it means to be human. The Mona Lisa, even reduced to a tourist spectacle, still holds a mystery, still refuses to resolve into a single meaning. The notebooks, even scattered and incomplete, still reveal a mind that was never satisfied with surfaces, that wanted to know what was underneath, what made things move, what held the world together. Leonardo did not finish things because he could not stop looking. Every answer led to another question. Every solution revealed another problem. He was someone for whom the world was infinitely complex and infinitely interesting, and who spent his life trying to see it as clearly as possible. That he did not finish is not a failure. It is the condition of the kind of work he was trying to do. You cannot finish an investigation of the world. You can only look and draw and ask and look again. The paintings that survive are enough. The Last Supper is enough, even damaged, even retouched, even struggling to hold itself together on the wall. The Mona Lisa is enough, even if it has become a symbol as much as a painting, even if you cannot see it in person without fighting through crowds, even if the image has been reproduced so many times that it is hard to see it freshly. The notebooks are enough, even scattered, even incomplete, even written in a mirror script that makes them hard to read. They are enough because they show what a single human mind can do when it refuses to accept the limits of what has already been thought. Leonardo's legacy is not just the work he made, but the way he thought about making. He believed that painting was not a decorative art, but a form of knowledge, that to paint something well, you had to understand it completely, that art and science were not separate disciplines but two ways of looking at the same world. He believed that the artist's job was not just to imitate appearances, but to investigate causes, to see beneath the surface, to make visible what was hidden. He believed that the world was knowable, that observation and experiment could reveal its workings, and that this knowledge was worth pursuing for its own sake, whether or not it led to fame or fortune or finished paintings. This belief was not common in his time, and it is not common now. Most people do not spend their lives asking questions that have no immediate use. Most people do not dissect corpses to understand how a smile works. Most people do not fill notebooks with drawings of water because they want to see the pattern in chaos. Leonardo did these things because he could not help it, because the world was too interesting to ignore, because every answer was also an invitation to look closer. He lived in a time when the boundaries between disciplines were not yet fixed, when a painter could also be an engineer, when the study of anatomy could inform the depiction of a face, when the observation of birds could lead to the design of a flying machine. He took full advantage of that openness, and in doing so he created a body of work that still feels larger than the categories we use to describe it. He was a painter, yes, but also a scientist, an engineer, an anatomist, a geologist, a visionary, a dreamer. He was all of these things at once, and he was none of them completely, because he was always moving, always looking, always reaching toward something just beyond his grasp. What he reached toward was not just knowledge but clarity, a way of seeing the world that was precise and compassionate, that understood the mechanics of a muscle and also the mystery of a smile, that could map the flow of a river and also feel the beauty of its movement. He did not achieve that clarity, at least not in the way he wanted, but he spent his life trying, and the trying is visible in everything he left behind. It is visible in the softness of the Mona Lisa's face, in the chaos of the Battle of Anghiari, in the precision of his anatomical drawings, in the spiral of a vortex drawn in a notebook and labeled with observations about water and air and time. Leonardo did not believe in genius as something given. He believed in work, in observation, in the slow accumulation of understanding through looking and testing and revising. He wrote, "I have been impressed with the urgency of doing. Knowing is not enough, we must apply. Being willing is not enough, we must do." He also wrote, "Art is never finished, only abandoned." Both statements are true, and both describe the life he lived, a life of constant doing, constant applying, constant abandoning of projects that could not be finished, because the vision was too large, the world too complex, the time too short. He is remembered now as the archetypal genius, the man who could do anything, the mind that saw everything. But that memory is only half true. He was brilliant, yes, but he was also human, struggling with patrons, running out of money, frustrated by materials that would not do what he wanted, haunted by projects that remained incomplete. He was someone who wanted more than the world could give him, and who kept asking anyway, kept looking, kept drawing, kept trying to see clearly. The work he left behind is not a monument. It is a conversation, still ongoing, between what he saw and what we see, between what he asked and what we are still trying to answer. The Last Supper asks us to look at a moment of human drama and see in it something about betrayal and love and the fragility of community. The Mona Lisa asks us to look at a face and see in it something about the mystery of presence, the way a person can be there and also withheld, known and also unknowable. The notebooks ask us to look at the world the way he did, with curiosity and precision and a willingness to be surprised by what we find. Leonardo's life was a long investigation, and the investigation is not over. People are still studying the Last Supper, still restoring it, still arguing about what can be saved and what is lost. People are still analyzing the Mona Lisa, still writing books about her smile, still trying to explain why this particular painting became what it became. People are still reading the notebooks, still finding new drawings, still discovering designs and observations that have never been fully understood. The work is still alive, still asking questions, still inviting us to look closer. What Leonardo saw in the end was that the world is worth looking at, that it is deep and strange and beautiful, that it reveals itself slowly to those who are willing to pay attention. He spent his life paying attention, and he left behind a record of that attention. Fragmentary, incomplete, but also astonishing in its range and depth. He showed what a single life could do if it refused to accept limits, if it insisted on asking questions even when the answers were not forthcoming, if it looked at the world with both precision and wonder. That is the gift he left, and it is still here, still available to anyone who is willing to look. You can stand in front of the Last Supper and see 12 men reacting to a piece of news, and in their reactions you can see something about what it means to be human, to be surprised, to be afraid, to be caught in a moment you did not choose. You can stand in front of the Mona Lisa and see a woman who may or may not be smiling, and in that ambiguity you can see something about the limits of knowledge, the way a person can be present and also remote, visible and also hidden. You can open one of his notebooks and see a drawing of a heart or a vortex or a flying machine, and in that drawing you can see a mind that was never satisfied, never finished, always reaching toward something just beyond its grasp. Leonardo did not finish the work. But the work does not need to be finished. It is enough that it exists, that it invites us to look, that it shows us what paying attention can reveal. That is what he spent his life doing, looking at the world and trying to see it clearly. That is what he left behind. A way of seeing, a way of asking, a way of being in the world that is still instructive, still inspiring, still alive. There are worse ways to spend a life than trying to see clearly. There are worse legacies than a few paintings and a few thousand pages of notes. Leonardo did what he could with the time he had, and what he did was extraordinary, not because he finished everything, but because he tried. Because he looked, because he spent 67 years asking questions and drawing what he saw and refusing to settle for easy answers. That kind of attention is rare, and it is also necessary. It is what makes art possible. It is what makes science possible. It is what makes it possible to look at the world and see in it something other than what we already know. Leonardo saw the world that way, and he spent his life trying to show others what he saw. He did not always succeed, but he tried, and the trying is visible in everything he made. It is visible in the way he painted a face, in the way he drew a muscle, in the way he mapped the movement of water. It is visible in his refusal to be satisfied, in his willingness to abandon a project if it was not working, in his determination to keep looking even when the looking did not lead anywhere obvious. It is visible in the gap between what he imagined and what he made. A gap that was not a failure, but a measure of how much he wanted, how much he saw, how much he believed was possible. That gap is still there, still visible, still instructive. It tells us that vision is larger than completion, that the questions we ask are as important as the answers we find, that the work of understanding the world is never finished. Leonardo knew this, and he lived accordingly. He did not finish the work, but he did the work, and that is what matters. The work is still here, still asking us to look, still showing us what a life of attention can reveal. So if you are standing in front of the Last Supper, or the Mona Lisa, or a page from one of his notebooks, take your time, look slowly, see what he saw, the way light falls, the way a face suggests an emotion, the way water moves in a spiral. See the precision and the mystery, the knowledge and the wonder, the finished and the unfinished. See the life that made these things, the mind that could not stop asking, the hand that kept drawing even when the projects were abandoned, and the patrons were impatient, and the materials were failing. See Leonardo, still looking, still asking, still trying to see clearly. That is what he did, and that is what he left behind. It is enough. It has always been enough. It is always. What makes a life singular is not the number of things finished, but the quality of attention brought to the world. Leonardo brought that attention in full measure for 67 years. He looked at water and saw not just a substance but a pattern of forces. He looked at a face and saw not just features but the mechanics of expression. He looked at a bird and saw not just flight but the principles that made flight possible. He spent his life looking, and what he saw he drew, and what he drew he left behind. The work is fragmentary, incomplete, scattered across museums and libraries and private collections. But it is also whole, in the sense that it shows a mind fully engaged with the world, asking the questions that mattered to him, pursuing the investigations that called to him, refusing to accept the limits of what was already known. This kind of life is rare. Most of us do not have the time or the freedom to spend years dissecting corpses, or drawing vortices, or designing machines that will not be built. But we can still learn from the way he looked, the way he asked, the way he refused to be satisfied with surfaces. We can still bring that quality of attention to the world around us, to the work we do, to the people we love. We can still ask questions, still look closely, still try to see what is actually there rather than what we expect to see. That is what Leonardo did, and that is what his work still teaches. If tonight felt like time well spent, a like or a subscribe is the quietest way to say so, and it helps more people find their way here. This is a channel for slow looking, for long stories, for the kind of attention that does not hurry. If that sounds like something you want more of, we'll be here. Wherever you are right now, in bed, on a long drive, in a room you are trying to make quiet, thank you for spending this time here. Leonardo spent his life looking at the world and trying to understand it, and in doing so he left behind something that is still worth looking at, still worth thinking about, still worth the kind of slow attention that a long night allows. His work is not complete, and it does not need to be. It is enough that it exists, that it invites us to look, that it shows us what paying attention can reveal. Rest well, the world is still here, still strange, still worth looking at. Leonardo knew that, and he spent his life proving it. The paintings are still on the walls, the drawings are still in the notebooks, the questions are still open. That is his legacy, not answers, but the invitation to keep looking. Sleep well, and when you wake, look closely. That is what he would have wanted.